on Wall Street.
Economic indicators.
Who knows where this is going to end up?
To understand the economy, you have to understand human nature.
This podcast is powered by Acast.
Did I ever tell you my Woody Harrelson story, John?
No, but go ahead.
I was presenting a show years ago on TV3 called Agenda.
I remember that.
And Woody Harrelson was in town. And I decided he was going to be a very, very good interview on the legalization of drugs.
Yeah.
Because his dad is doing double life or something in an American prison, never to get out. You know, the Supermax ones, never to get out. His dad was a hitman.
Yeah.
Right? So he was appearing at the Skull Film Festival. Okay, an obscure thing.
Yeah, never knew there was one.
We had to follow Woody and get him in situ into Dublin to do the interview. And there was lots of toing and froing and toing and froing and toing and froing. But eventually I got to interview him in Stephen's Green on the grass. And Woody, it was a lovely day.
Yeah.
We set the whole shot up. He eventually arrived and we'd had 4 or 5 iterations of trying to get the interview to happen.
Right. Were you lying down kind of?
We were lying down like two Romans after lunch, right?
After a big split.
But that's exactly what happened. So I was doing my whole, quite nerdy, well, actually, what do you think of the economics of drug taking, blah, blah, blah. He was so stoned.
Really?
And I'd say, well, what do you think of that? And he'd go, man, that's such an interesting question. And it was one of the great interviews I ever did. It was just lovely.
That's
it was
fantastic.
all zen. And we were talking about something that I really then and still do think that all drugs should be legalized. That I think the only way to actually control this craziness of gangs and violence and everything is to actually take away the reason why gangs get involved, which is they're illegal and they make enormous profits.
Yeah.
You take that away, you tax it like booze, and you know what? You're fine. But I remember saying that to Woody and he was like I remember he looked at me, he's kind of like, in his head, he's like, you've no idea how stoned I am.
Do you know another story about Woody Harrelson? I don't know why we're talking about him, but
I don't know why. By the way, how you doing? It's the podcast. It's Thursday. We'll talk economics in a second, but we're just chit-chatting about other stuff.
But he was, Trump invited him. I'm back to Trump, I know.
God, we just stop this Trump shit.
But Trump invited him to dinner and somebody was asking him afterwards, so how did it go? What was it like? And he goes, you know what? He spent the first hour talking about himself. So he had to excuse himself politely to go out and roll a big number so he can get through the second hour of Trump talking at him.
About himself.
Yeah.
About himself. Now, today we're going to talk about cities, John. What happens to cities? You know, I have many obsessions, right?
Indeed.
One obsession is dereliction, which I believe is basically...
There's some that we can't talk about as well.
Well, there are many obsessions we can't talk about, but it's state-sponsored vandalism.
Yes.
And we need to stop it. The other one is house prices, how you get them down. It's all to do with somebody taking responsibility for the city. And of course, after COVID, everyone's saying, is it the end of the city? Is it going to change? Et cetera, et cetera. So I decided this week we're going to talk to maybe one of the greatest experts worldwide on cities.
Yeah.
A fellow who wrote The Creative Class, very interesting book in about 2000, Creative Cities. He's talking about cities. He's a guy called Richard Florida, very brilliant American academic. I want to talk about Dublin, but I also want to talk about other Irish cities and obviously global cities. What happens after we have spent the last year inside? No offices, no commuting, working online. What does this do to our sense of the city? Let's listen to Richard Florida now. Have a listen and we come back and chat about it.
Great.
Richard Florida, listen, welcome to the podcast. As you know, you know Dublin, you know Ireland. The last time we spoke, you were actually speaking in Ireland. What do you think, I'm not talking about Ireland, but what do you think is the future of cities as a result of COVID? And then we can come back and talk about cities in this neck of the woods.
So I think big cities will be fine. You know, I've been able to use this time to go back and study the history of pandemics, something I knew nothing about. So that in general is telling me something. The fact that I've never really considered pandemics or been confronted with them in studying urbanization for more than 4 decades tell me that if you look at the long arc of urbanization and city development, pandemics have never derailed that. We've become more and more urban. We become more and more clustered. So I think, and you look at what New York has been through. Let's take London, for example, with the Blitz and the attacks. Let's take Berlin, which Berlin is one of Europe's greatest cities. And it was attacked, taken over by the Nazis, attacked by the Allies, partitioned, cut in half for decades, and yet still is one of Europe's great cities. So look, I think what we're likely to see, though, is a little bit of spreading, which might be good for a place like Dublin. And here's what I think. I think that in the past, if you were a hub like London or New York, Paris, Tokyo, the workforce, whether it was a knowledge worker or a manufacturing worker until quite recently with manufacturing, they had to locate in the metropolitan area, the catchment area. And certainly even when manufacturing moved to Asia, a lot of those knowledge workers then went to the downtown office district, the central business district. I think what COVID does and the rise of remote work for the fortunate of us is it gives us the ability to leapfrog that suburb. My dad, when he wanted to go to a suburb, he was a factory worker in Newark, moved like 5 miles away to another town in New Jersey.
Yeah.
Now for knowledge workers, I'll use UX examples. They could go to Miami. They could go to Nashville. They could go to a place like Bozeman, Montana, or Jackson Hole, Wyoming. They could go to Austin, Texas. I could go on and on. They can go to a lovely college town, or they can go to a rural area. I think what's going to happen is instead of people just going to the local suburb, they have more choice. And I think that choice for knowledge workers is going to be driven by amenity, and of two sorts. And then we can drill down. I think there'll be younger knowledge workers, professionals, who want complete urbanity. You're young, you're 23, you're 25. You want lots of job opportunities. You want lots of girls and boys. You want fun. And you'll go to the big city. And then for older knowledge workers who have a family, you might go to a second city. It's more affordable. You can get a bigger house. Schools are good. The pace of life is more family oriented. So, and I think that there'll be some people who want more of the so-called natural, if you think about the Irish context, there'll be some people who love Dublin and the city life of Dublin. And there'll be other people who might like more of the rural element of certain parts of the Irish countryside. They won't spread out across the entire Irish countryside, but there'll be lovely small towns where they can find their way of life.
And so because this will be joy to many, many people listening to the podcast, because lots and lots of people, Richard, as you'd imagine, were stuck in this 1990s, early 2000s rut of commuting large dormitory suburbs, not feeling really that the day is passing them by in the car or in a train or on a bus. What you're saying is, COVID plus technology has changed that outlook for people.
And I hate to say this because so many people have struggled. And if you think about those essential workers who've kept us alive, working in the factories, working in the warehouse, working to deliver, the struggles they've had with the virus and just to make ends meet. But I've never been happier. I needed this personal reset to get out of the rat race. And I talked to lots of people my age. I'm spending time with my 2 girls. We have a real family life. I take them to school. They go to a little pod school. They don't go to a real school. They go to a little pod school. I take them there. We spend every night together. I was traveling before, going to Ireland, going wherever. I'm not doing that. I'm doing this.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I have a better life. And I needed that personal reset. And I'm finding many, many other people who are saying the same thing. So yeah, I think we can get off that treadmill. And the word urbanist used for this now, we used to call it the live work community. Now they call it the 15-minute neighborhood. Yeah, where you can live, work, send your kids to school. I call it a complete community. And I think what we're going to see is instead of a dormitory neighborhood for living and a central office area for working, that's going to begin to morph. And for cities, tragically, I think the big thing facing cities is they're going to lose offices. There's no doubt about this in my mind, that London and maybe Dublin and New York they're going to be less office centric, and that's going to hurt. But the good thing is that office neighborhood can become an actual neighborhood. Those neighborhoods were always dead and kind of boring. And then I think work, both remote work, but I do think it's funny, David, back in the day, I was asked by WeWork when they were a functional company before that guy bilked them, to come in and do a consulting session with WeWork. And when I went in the office, it was amazing to me. It was beautiful, and it was all this co-working, and it had coffee. And I kind of said to my wife, well, look, this is where the creative class works, just laughing, making a joke at myself. And in the meeting, I said, why aren't you putting these WeWorks in the suburbs? And they laughed at me. They thought it was the funniest thing. But now when I talked to my friends who then left and now have gone off, they're like, you were right. In fact, we need co-working spaces in small towns, in suburbs, in rural areas where these remote workers can go for a meeting to have interaction. They don't want to go there every day, but they also don't want to go to the big city every day, especially if they live far away. They want to go to a place. And so what I'm thinking now is this idea of the neighborhood business district, that you move from an era of the central business district, which will still be there. I mean, Dublin will still have more offices than anywhere else in Ireland. London will still be an office city of the world, of course, but they'll be proportionally smaller. And you'll see more integration of working and living, not just in the home, but in these neighborhood. And for suburbs, maybe the old mall can be reconfigured. For rural areas, maybe the little town center gets a co-working space. So I think there's more of this reintegration of working and living, which is the way humans have always lived.
Well, I mean, the picture you're painting is a lot more civilized than this gravitational pull of the big city, sucking in all the resources, sucking in all the people. Can I ask you about housing, Richard? Housing. What do you think the future of urban housing is?
Well, I think we don't know. I think in the pandemic, we saw people with means in the United States in particular. And I think we have to separate out the United States. I mean, people in New York left. They were scared. People in San Francisco left. And a lot of that was young people. Remember, these are big college towns. Both New York and San Francisco have a lot of college and post-college kids whose mom and dad said, come home. We're too scared to leave you there. I think housing will be interesting. I think there's been a surge in demand for single family. I don't think that's going to stay. We're already seeing in US cities, condominium and apartment in New York, demand for apartment rentals is surging, and demand for condominiums is starting to. Now the prices have come down, which is good for Dublin, good for London, good for New York, good for San Francisco. But I do think one thing we'll see inside the house, if in the past 20 years, we've seen this emphasis on the big kitchen, the open family room, this place for the family to gather. I think there'll be more of a demand for offices in the home. So I do think the home will have two things. One, there'll be more of an emphasis on in-home exercise. I think that's a big trend. Yeah. And two, even more so in-home working. People are going to start to put this in a separate room or a part of a room they're going to devote. And what we're seeing, even in condominium and apartments, is demand for, it's really interesting, where you see the biggest price increases in the United States, bigger apartments, like 3 bedrooms rather than 1 and 2. And then if you have a little outdoor terrace, I think that people want a little outdoor space. They don't want to be trapped. So look, I think the big challenge is going to be affordable. Like, I think it's now the 60% or 70% of essential workers. And one thing I want to add, essential workers and racially minority workers and ethnic minority workers have been hit hard because they work in overcrowded conditions. They work with the public. They work around one another, and they live in overcrowded conditions, and they depend on transit when we can shelter in place or use a private car. To add insult to injury, so to speak, when you look at where the most possible remote work jobs are, they're in big cities. So they're in London, Dublin, New York, San Francisco. Yep. When those jobs leave, if we leave, we take our remote job with us to wherever we go, the Irish countryside, the Hudson River Valley outside of New York, a small town. That person who comprised the essential service economy is now out of work.
Exactly.
So as remote work decentralizes, the people who get hit the hardest are the essential workers who are crammed and jammed into cities, not only because they can't afford housing, because now their source of the market for their source of livelihood has shrunk.
So this is a serious concern, because here, you're well aware, all around the English-speaking world in particular, the cost of accommodation has really skyrocketed. It's not so much the case in the continental European countries, which are much more, rent is capped and you've got all sorts of interventions. But what is the future of the livable city if we don't get rents and accommodation and land prices under control?
Yeah, I'm worried. I mean, if you ask me, I kind of think the economy will boom after the pandemic. What is Goldman Sachs saying? 7.5% growth in the United States post-vaccine, which started slowly, but it's rolling out. You only need to look at Israel to see how many people will get there. So, and realize that the Spanish flu was followed by the Roaring 20s. So I think in our countries, we're going to see the Roaring 2020s. The real thing that I think it will happen is if you look back in history at the time there was the greatest class divide in modern memory, it was the 1920s. So I think we're going to see these accentuated class divides by class, by race, by ethnic background, by immigration status. And that will continue to pull us apart. And I think there's two things. One, I think for sure, David, we've got to build more affordable housing. And I think part of that is building more housing, for sure. Big cities.
Just full stop. Just build.
But we also have to build affordable housing. I think we have to build, and build with an eye to affordable housing. We have to figure out whether that's social housing or some kind of public-private partnership, which I think more is the model. We have to focus on building When I lived in New York City, I lived in a building in Lower Manhattan that 30% of the units were affordable housing. There were I rented. There were rich people who spent $10 million. I didn't spend that, but in that condominium building. And then there were people who probably paid $400 or $500 a month for rent. They weren't the indigent poor, but they were like nonprofit workers, teachers, but I think we have to build affordable housing. The second thing that I think we have to do is we have to create better jobs. And I think is if we look at, my dad always told me this story. He took a job in a factory in Victory Optical in Newark, New Jersey, making eyeglasses. When he was 13 to help support his family, it took 9 family members, my grandpa and grandma, him and his 6 siblings to make a family wage. And in fact, David,
wow.
They lived in a shared house in Newark with my dad's father and his 2 uncles. So it took 9 people to make a family wage, but it probably took 27 or 30 people to support the house. We're all working, you know. He said he came back from his service in World War II, serving along Irish. My dad was, he departed from the UK, went on shore in Normandy, stormed the beaches at Normandy. Wow, came back from the war,
that's a story.
Job in the same factory. He's like, all of a sudden I had a living wage. He didn't say that. He said, I made good money, Rich. He didn't say living wage. I made good money, Rich. The unions helped do that. He said FDR helped do that with the labor. He didn't call it the Wagner Act, the labor laws in the unions. They all helped me. And then I could buy a house and have 2 kids and put you 2 kids through college. We became middle class. Even though we're working class, my dad said we're middle class. Now we have about 60% of our workforce, 70% of our workforce doing essential low-end service work and some blue-collar work. We got to do the same thing for them. We decided as a society we'd pay more for eyeglasses or cars or appliances or steel so that working class could have a better job while alive. We could pay more for a freaking burger or to get a package delivered or for our groceries so that the people who are the essential workers on whom we depend have a living wage. And it's less. Like, we'll pay a few bucks more to get shit delivered. We paid a lot more for a car.
No, I hear you.
So to me, it's a no-brainer. We just have to affordable housing and better jobs together.
Well, that's an interesting point. It's a really fascinating point you make, Richard. The idea that the American society chose in the 1950s to pay more for consumer goods that blue-collar people made, so their wages went up, and it was a sort of a virtuous cycle. Right now in the States, I know Biden has changed the background noise, clearly. And it, we were just saying the other day in the podcast, it feels as if we're not even Americans, as if a nastiness has passed, okay, from the United States. But, if the United States continues to be driven like shareholder value and owners squeezing the assets and driving up profits, you're going to see more of this income going to the top 1% and less going down to the 60% that you're talking about. So do you think the whole US is going to be reframed?
Thank God Biden won. That's all I'm going to say. Thank the Lord. We moved to Canada during the W years, and both my girls are dual. My girls are dual citizens. We're not. We're permanent residents, and we're eligible for citizenship, and we'll probably get it. We're permanent residents in Canada and citizens of the United States. So, look, I think Biden is the right man for the right time, and you have to say something about the United States. I think Trump was necessary in a way. I hate the man with every bone in my body, and always, as a New Yorker, always hated him. But look, I think he exposed a nasty side of America that Americans needed to see. And I think people saw it. And then when they stormed the Capitol, I was crying. A grown man crying. Probably the last time I did that was 9/11. You saw an ugly side to America, which weren't the foreign terrorists, which were American terrorists. And you saw them ransacking the Capitol building. And so I think America needed to see that. I think Biden's better. But I think you put your finger on a bigger point. And I think it's getting worse. I think this oligarch class they for some, not all of them, there is a group of the business community which are ethical and decent. And,
Sure.
in the United States, not only has the 1%, 0.001% made off with all the money, gotten all the gains from the stock market, I think they're putting in place a race to the bottom. I'm looking in the United States now at these folks saying, why is there so much talk about decline of New York, decline of San Francisco, businesses leaving, people leaving San Francisco, leaving New York? There is a group of real estate developers, real estate investors, financial people, hedge fund managers, and techies who are saying to these towns, we want you to stop taxing us. We don't want to pay San Francisco or New York taxes. We don't want these regulations. We don't want to have to build affordable housing. To hell with you. We'll move to Florida or Texas, where the government is telling us to do nothing but establish shop here and pay no taxes because we don't have a state income tax. So I think in the United States, what we're seeing now is an accelerated race to the bottom, which is being celebrated, which worries me so much because there's so many people in this country saying, isn't this great? The companies are leaving San Francisco and New York and they're moving.
See, we can't, as Europeans, we're listening to this and we're saying that is a race to the bottom, as you've said. That is the opposite of what the wealthy class. I'm going to flip this and let's just talk a little
100%. We agree.
About history. You go to a city like Florence, okay, and you look around and you see the mercantile class in Florence in the 14th, 15th century, right? They said, we are going to build a beautiful city. We are going to pay our dues to our city by building magnificent buildings, by building extraordinary architecture, by having this public face of the city, which we regard as beautiful and we regard as something to be proud of. To what extent does, if we're going to talk about the oligarch class, right? To what extent do they have to kind of mirror? If you look at even a city like Dublin, the Victorian Dublin's put a lot of money into this place. The Georgians put a lot of money into this place. All great cities need a civic, responsible business class to thrive. That's my point.
And I think we're torn. I think, when I go to towns around the United States, when I go to a Bentonville, Arkansas, it's very interesting to look at what the young members of the Walton family are doing to invest back in their hometown of Bentonville, Arkansas. They're not building an HQ2 and moving an HQ2 to some other city. They're building the new Walmart headquarters and they're building up Arkansas. When I go to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and I look what the Kaiser Family Foundation is doing to invest and build the best new park in America and focus on remote workers, I think there's two groups. I think there's a group that wants to reinvest and do everything you said. And in a lot of small towns, these are groups that have decided they want to help their families, help their communities. And then there's a group of more rapacious people who are saying, I'm the one. I'm the new Messiah. Yeah. I have all the technological tools of the trade. I'm the one creating wealth and value. To hell with anyone else. I can do this. And so I think the United States is torn. I do think, though, the day of reckoning is coming. And by the way, look back to the 1920s, robber baron capitalism, the days before FDR, the days before the social compacts in Ireland, in the United Kingdom, across Western Europe. So look, I think there's some struggles that have to happen. People have to rise up and say enough's enough. And I think, one thing that heartens me is this incredible wave of protests that I saw. I lived through the protests of the 60s. Those were largely minority and largely student. Yeah. These protests were cross-class, cross-race, cross-age group. What went under the banner of Black Lives Matter was a great group of people in the United States around the world saying enough's enough. So I'm hopeful that the arc of history points in the right direction, but I'm also worried. I'm worried about this rapacious group of capitalists and this race to the bottom. So I think the better age of our nature will prevail, but this is a real struggle.
Can we just go worldwide now? I mean, one of the extraordinary things about urbanization in the last 30 years is the rise of these mega cities, some places that I'd never even heard of. Suddenly you turn up and they've a population of 10 million, 15 million, 20 million. What is the future of urbanization? I read some statistic that in the next 40 years, 60% of people will live in 2% of the world's landmass in the cities. What's your sense of our ability to manage this?
We're done. I mean, the advanced countries are near completely urbanized. And urbanization has shifted to Asia and Africa and the global South. In my book, The New Urban Crisis, I devoted a whole chapter to this. Maybe some people say it's not enough. I should write a whole other book on this. But in the past, urbanization tended to lift all boats. If you look at Ireland, England, France, the United States, Germany, Japan, the advanced industrial countries. Urbanization, as it occurred, tended to go hand in hand with industrialization. You developed factory complexes. There was local agriculture at the periphery. And not every boat, but many boats rose, and you got the development of a middle class and a rising standard of living. Well, in the global world we live today, you're no longer going to develop in a way where urbanization equals industrialization equals rising boats equals a middle class. Cities are part of a global system. And, food is raised in one part of the world, things are made in another part of the world, and stuff is shipped around. So what we've seen now is a breakpoint. Urbanization no longer. Some people call this poor people's urbanization. Other people call this urbanization without growth. We've seen this breaking of a connection between urbanization and boats rising. And look at the spread of this virus. It has been just horrific. We don't have great statistics, but you look at the spread of the virus in places like India and in the slums of Latin America where people can't social or physically distant, where medical services are rudimentary. So, yeah, I think these divides get bigger at the global level. I think, by the way, city building and investing in cities and investing in urbanization is the number one priority of the 21st century, but it's a hard argument to get people to take. People still don't understand how important this is. And whether it's climate change, energy, poverty, health, all of those reduce, in my mind, to better models of urbanization.
Just before we go, I mean, the one thing we've seen about COVID, I look at it here in Dublin, but I got friends in London, I got friends, huge amounts of cycle lanes being built. A significant jolt to the way people think. You've got Anne Hidalgo in her 15-minute city. We've talked about the fact that the office will not dominate the centre of the city in the way it did. To what extent has this been the sort of wake-up call that urbanists like yourself have been hoping would stop people thinking about economics on a national level and begin to think about economics on a city level? They're kind of like the Jane Jacobs original idea that cities ferment dissent, good times, good ideas, innovations, and away we go.
I do think pandemics register themselves. We forget pandemics. So, for example, and I worry about it. I was born in 1957 during the middle of that pandemic. No one mentioned it to me. My parents were both born in the 1920s, but they were the youngest. All of my aunts and uncles, like 14 aunts and uncles on each side, all of them were either born or toddlers during the Spanish flu. I never knew that. They called the Spanish flu the Great Forgetting, the Great Forgotten. So I think we look past these things. We have the roaring 20s or roaring 2020s. I do think they register in the built environment. Like what we've gotten out of past pandemics are better parks, better open space, bigger boulevards, better health and sanitation, building codes for light and ventilation. I do think the bike lanes will stick. There may be some retrenchment. I think they'll stick. I think the outside dining, the fact that, Europe has always had outside dining, but the United States never did. I think that will stick. I think we still have to bring more of the office outside. I think that more of the things we do, even parts of education, can be done better outside. We need to get rid of these buildings with windows that don't open. But I think these advances will be for the wealthy. And for those of us with means, the advantage third, we can take advantage of this. But those of us without that will not have access to any of it. So you'll have better neighborhoods, closer to work, better amenities, more cycling, fitter people. We'll be fitter and healthier because we're outside. And that divide based on where we live and our socioeconomic status will grow. So that's what I see. Better, Jane Jacobs kind of urbanism for the relatively advantaged, and worse for the not so advantaged. And that sort of, I think, is the big issue from our times. The way I phrase this is we can't just rebuild cities or reset cities. We have to put it intentionally rebuild with an eye towards inclusivity and resiliency. I mean, if we don't focus on building more inclusive cities, they won't just happen. In fact, they will become more divided. They won't become more resilient. They'll become less resilient.
Richard Florida, we will leave it at that note. But listen, thank you so much.
Thank you, David.
Cheers,
Great
Richard.
seeing you.
Take care, man. Bye.
I love that guy's name.
Richard Florida.
Richard Florida.
He's a hitman. He's a hitman for The Sopranos.
Like, we've been talking on and off since the podcast started.
For 50 years.
Well, we were talking about how house prices are going up. And last week we talked about the weirdness of house prices going up in the middle of a pandemic when you would have thought they'd been going down. But one thing I did come across during the week there was the fact that Suburban house prices are certainly going up, but centre city apartments are actually going down in value.
Yeah, because the city needs to be reimagined. Because most people are thinking, hold on a second, right? What was interesting about Dublin? Whether we're talking about Dublin or Amsterdam or London or Paris, it doesn't matter. What was interesting was, number one, this was the social centre of the country.
Yeah.
Restaurants, bars, clubs, places to go out, all that sort of stuff. You take all that out, and you take out the fact that you don't have to be in the office anymore.
Yeah.
And suddenly people are saying, a bit like Richard was saying, what's the point of the city? Now, his view was that, hold on a second, cities are incredibly difficult things to destroy, and COVID will not destroy them.
Yeah.
But it'll definitely change them. So the first thing is Dublin apartments were too expensive in the first place.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Far too. So the price should drop. Dublin rents were too high in the first place. So those rents should drop. And the apartment price can only be a reflection of the income of the apartment, which is the rent. So if rents are falling, and of course, what's going to happen to all the office space?
Yeah.
Look, what we're talking about prior to COVID is probably the most stupid use of space we can even imagine. We have a house which is empty during the day but full at night.
Yeah.
We have an office which is full during the day and empty at night. Why don't you put the two of them together? That's the obvious thing, right? And COVID has said, this can be done. But the question then is, what do you do with cities? Because you can't just abandon the city, right? And again, what Richard Florida was saying there was also quite interesting. He was saying suburbs and small towns and rural towns are going to become much more attractive places to live and to work.
Yeah.
So what you're saying in Ireland is, as you said, prices going up in the suburbs. As people say, I want to live there, and frankly, I don't want to be in the city.
Yeah.
But then the city itself has got to really quickly, this is the point, deal with the fact that the world has changed. If cities decide that we're going to wait for a while, we're not going to be proactive, and he was talking about being proactive, what's going to happen is that gradually the office spaces will empty out, the living spaces will empty out. If you've no living space, if no one living in the city and coming into work, why would you have a restaurant there?
Yeah.
Why would you have a bar in the city? Like the bars in Dublin City and the restaurants in Dublin City survive on three things: office workers, tourists, and local traffic.
Yeah.
Now, given that local traffic, i.e. the amount of people who live in the city, is very small, by virtue, it's very, very small because there aren't that many apartments, right?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Tourism's gone and office traffic's gone. So if people really want to worry about Dublin, and there's many Irish people who don't, but there's many who do, we've got to be much more proactive now.
But it's
and
not
really quickly proactive.
But it's not just Dublin as well. Like it'd be all.
It's London, it's Paris, it's all those
Yeah.
places.
But Cork and Limerick and Galway as well.
Yeah, exactly.
So when you talk about a conscious decision, then whose conscious decision is this?
Well, you see, this is what has always amazed me. So if you're in Cork or in Galway or in Dublin, who is it, what individual wakes up in the morning
Yeah.
when they're brushing their teeth and says, I'm worried about Dublin, I'm worried about Cork? Nobody. There isn't one political person whose total career is dependent on getting the place to work. Yet, you take a city like Dublin,
Yeah.
Dublin raises more than half the tax revenue of the whole country. Think about that, right?
Yeah. Well, that stands to reason.
Well, it doesn't. In actual fact, most big cities should not be half as dominant. You know, if you think in most countries, the major city shouldn't have half the tax revenue. It should be something much, much smaller, right?
Okay.
But only Dublin and London have that craziness. Take, for example, a city like Berlin. Berlin is the capital of Germany,
Yeah.
but it contributes nothing tax-wise to Germany because it's much poorer. So you've got a very strange thing.
Oh,
Berlin
okay.
is one of the poorest cities in Germany, yet it's the capital. We in Ireland assume that the capital city has to be dramatically dominant. That's not the case. Like Washington in the United States
Yeah.
is a small effort. But I mean, what I'm saying is that Dublin needs somebody to grab it by the scruff of the neck and say, I am responsible for that city, or
So
we are responsible
So Dublin is the main commercial centre
of the country.
Of the country.
and outsized in comparison to most other.
Sure, but then, the rest of the country, smaller counties rely on that.
Oh yeah, and
So-
that's always going to be the case.
Yeah.
But no, what I worry about is that already the centre of Dublin is really shabby. Dereliction everywhere, right? Main roads, proper retail streets with derelict buildings in them. Like, what's that all about, right? No real sense of an urban plan, no real sense of people living in the city. Nobody's saying, you know what, come and live within the canals.
So who are you talking about? Whose responsibility should this be? Is it not the county council's responsibility?
So I think there should be three things should happen in Dublin and all Irish cities. And you can say your city is any conurbation above 100,000. Let's say that's the thing. First, everyone needs a directly elected mayor with tax revenue raising powers where the buck stops with him or her. First, right?
Okay.
Second thing is a hoarding tax. We've talked about this before.
Yeah.
But a tax on hoarding land, because land needs to be used. It's this Henry George idea, right?
Yeah.
That if you don't penalise people for not using land, land will be idle. And ultimately, then you've got dereliction. And once you get dereliction, it's that broken windows theory.
Yeah.
Which is,
spirals downwards.
the place beside me is derelict. Therefore, people don't go down the street. Then they don't particularly like the street. Then the next building is derelict. And what you get is an epidemic of dereliction. Cork City at the moment is suffering an epidemic of dereliction. Cork is, and Dublin could go that way.
Right.
And Dublin and Cork are interesting architectural heritage cities, right? And then, of course, you'd hoard land, but you also need revenue raising. But not only revenue raising, you need the city to be able to finance big things. So if you decide that Dublin wants, for example, I've always thought that Dublin Port should be moved.
Sure.
I think it's the wrong place at the wrong time. I think the idea of having a port at the end of a river only makes sense if the river is your superhighway for traffic, as it was in 1510.
Yeah.
Okay, nothing comes down the fucking Liffey. Think about it, right? Yeah, we've got a port at the end of the Liffey. What you could do is just move the port to Drogheda or somewhere where there's actually a deep water port. The reason I say Drogheda is because I think in the unified island economy of the future, this Dublin-Belfast conurbation will be so significant that your port should be there. So Belfast Port and Dublin Port should
halfway
just be...
between. Yeah. Makes sense.
Lots of people would say, well, because of Brexit, you should have put it down by Rosslare because we're going to go around the UK, all that stuff.
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter. Get it out of Dublin, right? And reclaim a new city where Dublin Port was. I mean, we've talked about this before.
Yeah.
But the question is, how do you finance that? So most sensible cities issue municipal bonds. So the city itself raises money.
Okay.
And pays money.
Okay, so explain a municipal bond compared to a regular bond.
Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about those three issues. Directly elected mayor, the hoarding tax, and the municipal bond, right?
Okay.
Years and years ago, John, I remember going on a trip to Finland when I was working for a large bank. And I was kind of trying to figure out, what the hell am I doing? Who am I talking to? And who I was talking to were the municipal bond issuers of Finnish cities, right?
Okay.
So you go to Helsinki and Helsinki raises money itself, right? So Helsinki wants to build, I don't know, an underground and it's cost them €1 billion. They raise the money, right?
Yeah.
And I was talking to the people in the council.
From Helsinkians.
No, from the international market, or maybe Helsinkians as well.
Right.
So, John, municipal bonds, right? If we want to think about the 21st century, how do you finance a city like Dublin? Let's say we want a metro or we want to move the port, as I was talking about. You need to raise your own money. Now, in America, for example, municipal bonds are the way in which most cities finance schools, highways, all that sort of public infrastructure, social housing, etc.
Okay.
In 2019, American cities raised $250 billion in bonds. So they go to the market and say, the city of Dublin would like to raise bonds.
Right.
And the market says, okay, well, let's rate the city of Dublin, right? So I'll give you an idea of how big Dublin is.
Right.
Dublin raises 22 billion euros of taxes every year, right?
Okay.
Slovenia, country, former Yugoslavia.
Yeah.
Okay. Last week, borrowed money at less than 0.7%.
Right.
Slovenia's total tax take is 15 billion euros. So
Jeez.
Dublin
Okay.
is bigger.
Yeah.
So we could raise money for this city at really fractional cost. Now then you think, okay, that is the big amount. So how much do you need to service that loan? So let's say we're, just to make it simple, we're going to raise 100 quid.
Yeah.
Rates of interest at 1%. We've got to come up with revenue of €1 per year to finance 99 euros of capital investment.
Right.
That's what's happening, right?
Yeah.
Now, of course, then you get a directly elected mayor. We vote for that mayor. That mayor says we're going to raise Dublin taxes, maybe VAT on stuff sold in Dublin. Very quickly, what you have is you have a financial infrastructure in the city that can actually go and do things.
Sorry, you have different rate of VAT in Dublin, say inside the M50.
Yeah.
To the rest of, so it's what is it? VAT is 21%.
Say it's VAT, yeah.
Yeah,
So it's 22%.
So you put 22% in Dublin,
And so lots of people will go shopping in Bray. People say, I'm not going to pay that.
Yeah.
People will, but not that many.
Right.
Because it's a small amount. But because interest rates are so low, you only have to raise a tiny amount of capital to pay the stream of income of the bond, which you use the bond to finance the big things.
Yeah. When do you pay back the capital?
Well, I mean, Slovenia raised a 70-year bond, so a long time away.
Right.
A long time away, you know what I mean?
So we just put that to the back of the...
Yeah, but that's the way, that's the magic of the bond market I've told you about. But I'll give you some figures, right, John, in terms of what Dublin does, right? Dublin raises 61% of all Ireland's VAT. That's 7 billion. All, right? 52% of all Ireland's PAYE, about 8.5 billion. 45% of all self-employed income tax, that's about 1.1 billion. 62% of all corporation tax, about 5 billion. And 43% of all capital gains tax, around 360 million. So what you have is a particularly vibrant economic entity.
Yeah.
Right? Now, in terms of the rest of Ireland, Dublin raises, I was saying about that, 22 billion in total. About 15 billion is spent in Dublin. So 7 billion goes to your Leitrim's, your Offaly's, your Donegals of this world. But my point is that unless you have somebody who's waking up in the morning worrying about what are we going to do with these office spaces that we now have to reconvert into residential? What are we going to do about Dublin Port? What are we going to do about a metro system? Unless you have somebody who actually takes responsibility, things don't get done.
Yeah.
And the reason things don't get done, I've got a theory, which is that a directly elected mayor from Dublin would be the most powerful politician in the country. They'd have the biggest budget and they'd have the biggest mandate.
Right,
and
okay.
Dáil Ireland doesn't want that because the way in which Ireland has been structured, maybe rightly, maybe wrongly, is what I would call the Sunday game approach to economics, right?
Okay. With Desi Cal.
Yeah, Desi Cal, our old mate from the same street as us.
Yeah.
Brought up on the same street as us. Exactly.
Cut from the same
Cut
cloth.
from the same cloth, exactly. Eamon McCamash, Misha Dublin. Do you remember Misha Boy out there? My Dublin, Eamon McCamash. Desi, how you doing? Shout out for Desi Cal. Big up for the Desmond. But my point is, because of the county structure in Ireland, and because of the way in which we vote in TDs, so you have TDs from every county shouting about their county, right?
Yeah.
What happens is the Dublin voice gets drowned out, I think, right? Now, I'm not saying this is right or wrong. I'm just saying this is the way this society has evolved. So you have the county that delivers half the tax tends not to be represented. And counties that deliver much less tend to be overrepresented in the Dáil.
Okay.
And that's the way it works, right? But the problem is, as Richard Florida was saying, cities are the dynamo of economic growth. They are the metropolises where everything happens, where the innovation happens, where the sales happens, where the people leave their villages and their places down the country to come to reinvent themselves. If you take the idea that moving house, leaving home is a transformational act for the individual.
Yeah.
So everybody who says, I was born in some place in Mayo or whatever, says, I want to leave, I want to come to Dublin.
Yeah.
Right? That is an act of transformation, right? In the same way as when you and I left here to go to London, it's like, I don't want to be from here, I want to go somewhere else. So the cities, the metropolis always has that interesting energy, excitement, the ability to change, right? So therefore, in a country like Ireland, we definitely need our cities to be well financed.
Sure.
Because they are the dynamo of change,
Yeah.
right? And the people want to live here, and the immigrants and people like JM, they want to come and live in this city. So it strikes me that we need to be, one is a directly elected mayor. To go back to Richard Florida's point, we've got to fix the cities. 2, we need municipal bonds. And then 3, we need the mayor to be the custodian of the city. And when I say the custodian, to look after the place. And if you have dereliction, if you have this extraordinary increase in land prices, if you have an amazing situation, I've always said that dereliction is a function of wealth, not poverty.
Yeah.
We need to go and look at taxing hoarding. And the reason I believe we don't do this is that lots of the landlords who own buildings in the cities, like Dublin, are not from Dublin. You're not living in the city. I think the people who make decisions for the city need to be of the city. Not necessarily 10-generation Dubs, right?
Yeah.
But they need to live in the place and the consequences of their actions. Because when I see how Dublin was planned, and again, Richard Florida was talking about around the car, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Exclusively around the car. So you get a medieval city, which is maybe takes 400 or 500 years to begin to develop an identity. In 10 or 15 years, you get people saying, well, we should have a road there and a road there.
Yeah.
And you destroy the place. But now what I'm saying is post-COVID, John, and this is the important thing, you can't just wait around for these things to happen. I think somebody's got to go and take responsibility for the city, not just Dublin, but Toronto or London or wherever. Because if you just let the free market do it,
Yeah.
you lose something magical. So I think time is now ripe for a mayor with tax-raising powers and financed by municipal bonds to actually go in there and change the landscape. Otherwise, the flight that you notice at the top from Dublin City will just continue. Now, why I have you there again, why not use the time when you're locked up to learn economics? Join me on Patreon. Patreon.com/David McWilliams. Let's learn economics together. We have the economics course. Macroeconomics has never been as essential to understand. We have the Ask Mac tutorials every other week. We have Q&A. We've got the reading list. And more importantly, you become part of the community. If you have a question, if you have something that's going on you want to ask me, join me on Patreon. Email in. I will answer your question. But more importantly, it's ad-free. Just you and me and your man across the way.
Hey.
Patreon.com/Dave McWilliams, and let's figure out the world together.